Hello, and welcome back to the Reading Corner. I'm your host Renee, and I am here for you every Wednesday, reading stories that are in the public domain. Currently, we are reading The Professor, written by Charlotte Brontë, and this is starting at chapter 9, so if you haven't heard any of the previous episodes from The Professor, go back and watch those first, or you'll be a little lost because we're already partway through the book. Let's jump into it. Chapter 9. Monsieur Pelet could not, of course, object to the proposal made by Mademoiselle Reuter. Permission to accept such additional employment should it offer, having formed an article of the terms on which he had engaged me. It was, therefore, arranged in the course of next day that I should be at liberty to give lessons in Mademoiselle Reuter's establishment 4 afternoons in every week. When evening came, I prepared to step over in order to seek a conference with Mademoiselle herself on the subject. I had not had time to pay the visit before, having been all day closely occupied in class. I remember very well that before quitting my chamber, I held a brief debate with myself as to whether I should change my ordinary attire for something smarter. At last I concluded it would be a waste of labor. Doubtless, thought I, she is some stiff old maid, for though the daughter of Madame Reuter, she may well number upwards of 40 winters. Besides, if it were otherwise, if she be both young and pretty, I am not handsome, and no dressing can make me so. Therefore, I'll go as I am. And off I started, cursorily glancing sideways as I passed the toilet table, surmounted by a looking-glass. A thin, irregular face I saw, with sunk dark eyes under a large square forehead. Complexion destitute of bloom or attraction. Something young, but not youthful. No object to win a lady's love. No butt for the shafts of Cupid. I was soon at the entrance of the pensionnat. In a moment I had pulled the bell. In another moment the door was opened, and within appeared a passage paved alternately with black and white marble. The walls were painted in imitation of marble also, and at the far end opened a glass door, through which I saw shrubs and a grass plat, looking pleasant in the sunshine of the mild spring evening, for it was now the middle of April. This, then, was my first glimpse of the garden, but I had not time to look long. The portress, after having answered in the affirmative my question as to whether her mistress was at home, opened the folding doors of a room to the left, and having ushered me in, closed them behind me. I found myself in a salon with a very well-painted, highly varnished floor, chairs and sofas covered with white draperies, a green porcelain stove, walls hung with pictures in gilt frames, a gilt pendule, and other ornaments on the mantelpiece, a large lustre pendant from the center of the ceiling, mirrors, consoles, muslin curtains, and a handsome center table completed the inventory of furniture. All looked extremely clean and glittering, but the general effect would have been somewhat chilling had not a second large pair of folding doors, standing wide open and disclosing another and smaller salon, more snugly furnished, offered some relief to the eye. This room was carpeted, and therein was a piano, a couch, a chiffoniere. Above all, it contained a lofty window with a crimson curtain, which, being undrawn, afforded another glimpse of the garden, through the large clear panes, round which some leaves of ivy, some tendrils of vine, were trained. "Monsieur Crimsworth, n'est-ce pas?" said a voice behind me, and starting involuntarily, I turned. I had been so taken up with the contemplation of the pretty little salon that I had not noticed the entrance of a person into the larger room. It was, however, Mademoiselle Reuter who now addressed me, and stood close beside me, and when I had bestowed with instantaneously recovered sang-froid, for I am not easily embarrassed, I commenced the conversation by remarking on the pleasant aspect of her little cabinet, and the advantage she had over Monsieur Pelet in possessing a garden. "Yes," she said, she often thought so, and added, "It is my garden, monsieur, which makes me retain this house. Otherwise, I should probably have removed to larger and more commodious premises long since." But you see, I could not take my garden with me, and I should scarcely find one so large and pleasant anywhere else in town. I approved her judgment. But you have not seen it yet, said she, rising. Come to the window and take a better view. I followed her. She opened the sash, and leaning out, I saw in full the enclosed demesne, which had hitherto been to me an unknown region. It was a long, not a very broad strip of cultured ground, with an alley bordered by enormous old fruit trees down the middle. There was a sort of lawn, a parterre of rose trees, some flower borders, and on the far side a thickly planted copse of lilacs, laburnums, and acacias. It looked pleasant to me, very pleasant. So long a time had elapsed since I had seen a garden of any sort. But it was not only on Mademoiselle Reuter's garden that my eyes dwelt. When I had taken a view of her well-trimmed beds and budding shrubberies, I allowed my glance to come back to herself, nor did I hastily withdraw it. I had thought to see a tall, meagre, yellow, conventual image in black, with a close white cap bandaged under the chin like a nun's headgear, whereas there stood by me a little and roundly formed woman, who might indeed be older than I, but was still young. She could not, I thought, be more than 6 or 27. She was as fair as a fair Englishwoman. She had no cap, her hair was nut brown, and she wore it in curls. Pretty her features were not, nor very soft, nor very regular, but neither were they in any degree plain, and I already saw cause to deem them expressive. What was their predominant cast? Was it sagacity? Sense? Yes, I thought so, but I could scarcely as yet be sure. I discovered, however, that there was a certain serenity of eye and freshness of complexion, most pleasing to behold. The color on her cheek was like the bloom on a good apple, which is as sound at the core as it is red on the rind. Mademoiselle Reuter and I entered upon business. She said she was not absolutely certain of the wisdom of the step she was about to take, because I was so young, and parents might possibly object to a professor like me for their daughters. But it is often well to act on one's own judgment, said she, and to lead parents rather than to be led by them. The fitness of a professor is not a matter of age, and from what I have heard, and from what I observe myself, I would much rather trust you than Monsieur Le Dros, the music master, who is a married man of near 50. I remarked that I hoped she would find me worthy of her good opinion, that if I knew myself, I was incapable of betraying any confidence reposed in me. Du reste, said she, the surveillance will be strictly attended to. And then she proceeded to discuss the subject of terms. She was very cautious, quite on her guard. She did not absolutely bargain, but she warily sounded me to find out what my expectations might be, and when she could not get me to name a sum, she reasoned and reasoned with a fluent yet quiet circumlocution of speech, and at last nailed me down to 500 francs per annum. Not too much, but I agreed. Before the negotiation was completed, it began to grow a little dusk. I did not hasten it, for I liked well enough to sit and hear her talk. I was amused with the sort of business talent she displayed. Edward could not have shown himself more practical, though he might have evinced more coarseness and urgency, and then she had so many reasons, so many explanations, and after all she succeeded in proving herself quite disinterested and even liberal. At last she concluded she could say no more, because as I acquiesced in all things, there was no further ground for the exercise of her parts of speech. I was obliged to rise. I would rather have sat a little longer. What had I to return to but my small empty room? And my eyes had a pleasure in looking at Mademoiselle Reuter, especially now, when the twilight softened her features a little, and in the doubtful dusk I could fancy her forehead as open as it was really elevated, her mouth touched with turns of sweetness as well as defined in lines of sense. When I rose to go, I held out my hand, on purpose, though I knew it was contrary to the etiquette of foreign habits. She smiled and said, "Ah, c'est comme tous les Anglais," but gave me her hand very kindly. "It is the privilege of my country, mademoiselle," said I. "And remember, I shall always claim it." She laughed a little, quite good-naturedly, and with the sort of tranquillity obvious in all she did, a tranquillity which soothed and suited me singularly. At least, I thought so that evening. Brussels seemed a very pleasant place to me when I got out again into the street, and it appeared as if some cheerful, eventful, upward-tending career were even then opening to me, on that self-same mild, still April night. So impressionable a being is man, or at least such a man as I was in those days. Chapter 10. Next day, the morning hours seemed to pass very slowly at Monsieur Pelet's. I wanted the afternoon to come, that I might go again to the neighboring pensionnat and give my first lesson within its pleasant precincts. For pleasant they appeared to me. At noon, the hour of recreation arrived. At 1 o'clock we had lunch. This got on the time, and at last St. Gadel's deep bell, tolling slowly 2, marked the moment for which I had been waiting. At the foot of the narrow back stairs that descended from my room, I met Monsieur Pelet. "Comme vous avez l'air rayonnante," said he. "Je ne vous ai jamais vu aussi gai. Qu'est-ce qu'il donc passe?" "Apparemment que j'aime les changements," replied I. "Ah, je comprends. C'est cela, soyez sage seulement. Vous êtes bien jeune, trop jeune pour le rôle que vous allez jouer. Il faut prendre garde, savez-vous." "Mais quel danger y a-t-il?" "Je n'en sais rien. Ne vous laissez pour aller à de vives impressions. Voilà tout." I laughed. A sentiment of exquisite pleasure played over my nerves at the thought that vives impressions were likely to be created. It was the deadness, the sameness of life's daily ongoings that had hitherto been my bane. My blouse-clad élève in the boys' seminary never stirred in me any vive impression, except it might be occasionally some of anger. I broke from Monsieur Pelet, and as I strode down the passage he followed me with one of his laughs, a very French, rakish, mocking sound. Again I stood at the neighboring door, and soon was readmitted into the cheerful passage with its clear, dove-colored imitation marble walls. I followed the portress, and descending a step and making a turn, I found myself in a sort of corridor. A side door opened. Mademoiselle Reuter's little figure, as graceful as it was plump, appeared. I could now see her dress in full daylight. A neat, simple mousseline gown fitted her compact round shape to perfection. Delicate little collar and manchettes of lace, trim Parisian brodequin, showed her neck, wrists, and feet to complete advantage. But how grave was her face as she came suddenly upon me! Solicitude and business were in her eye, on her forehead. She looked almost stern. Her "Bonjour, monsieur," was quite polite, but so orderly, so commonplace, it spread directly a cool, damp towel over my vive impression. The servant turned back when her mistress appeared, and I walked slowly along the corridor side by side with Mademoiselle Reuter. "Monsieur will give a lesson in the first class today," said she. "Dictation or reading will perhaps be the best thing to begin with, for those are the easiest forms of communicating instruction in a foreign language, and at the first a master naturally feels a little unsettled." She was quite right, as I had found from experience. It only remained for me to acquiesce. We proceeded now in silence. The corridor terminated in a hall, large, lofty, and square. A glass door on one side showed within a long, narrow refectory, with tables, an armoire, and 2 lamps. It was empty. Large glass doors in front opened on the playground and garden. A broad staircase ascended spirally on the opposite side. The remaining wall showed a pair of great folding doors, now closed and admitting, doubtless, to the classes. Mademoiselle Reuter turned her eye laterally on me to ascertain, probably, whether I was collected enough to be ushered into her sanctum sanctorum. I suppose she judged me to be in a tolerable state of self-government, for she opened the door, and I followed her through. A rustling sound of uprising greeted our entrance, Without looking to the left or right, I walked straight up the lane between two sets of benches and desks, and took possession of the empty chair and isolated desk raised on an estrade of one high step, so as to command one division, the other division being under the surveillance of a maitresse similarly elevated. At the back of the estrade, and attached to a movable partition dividing this schoolroom from another beyond, was a large tableau of wood, painted black and varnished. A thick crayon of white chalk lay on my desk for the convenience of elucidating any grammatical or verbal obscurity which might occur in my lessons by writing it upon the tableau. A wet sponge appeared beside the chalk to enable me to efface the marks when they had served the purpose intended. I carefully and deliberately made those observations before allowing myself to take one glance at the benches before me. Having handled the crayon, looked back at the tableau, fingered the sponge in order to ascertain that it was in a right state of moisture, I found myself cool enough to admit of looking calmly up and gazing deliberately around me. And first I observed that Mademoiselle Reuter had already glided away. She was nowhere visible. A maitresse, or teacher, the one who occupied the corresponding estrade to my own, alone remained to keep guard over me. She was a little in the shade, and with my short sight I could only see that she was of a thin, bony figure and rather tallowy complexion, and that her attitude as she sat partook equally of listlessness and affectation. More obvious, more prominent, shone on by the full light of the large window, were the occupants of the benches just before me, of whom some were girls of 14, 15, 16, some young women from 18, as it appeared to me, up to 20. The most modest attire, the simplest fashion of wearing the hair were apparent in all, and good features, ruddy blooming complexions, large and brilliant eyes, forms full, even to solidity, seemed to abound. I did not bear the first view like a stoic. I was dazzled. My eyes fell, and in a voice somewhat too low, I murmured, "Prenez vos cahiers de dictée, mademoiselles." Not so had I bid the boys at Palais take their reading books. A rustle followed, and an opening of desks. Behind the lifted lids which momentarily screened the heads bent down to search for exercise books, I heard titterings and whispers. "Ouh là là, je suis prête à palmer de rire," observed one. "Comme il a rougi en parlant. Oui, c'est une véritable blanc-bec. Tais-toi, Hortense, il nous écoute." And now the lids sank and the heads reappeared. I had marked 3, the whisperers, and I did not scruple to take a very steady look at them as they emerged from their temporary eclipse. It is astonishing what ease and courage their little phrases of flippancy had given me. The idea by which I had been awed was that the youthful beings before me, with their dark, nun-like robes and softly braided hair, were a kind of half-angels. The light titter, the giddy whisper, had already in some measure relieved my mind of that fond and oppressive fancy. The 3 I allude to were just in front, within half a yard of my estrade, and were among the most womanly-looking present. Their names I knew afterwards, and may as well mention now. They were Eulalie, Hortense, Caroline. Eulalie was tall and very finely shaped. She was fair, and her features were those of a low country Madonna. Many a figure de Vierge have I seen in Dutch pictures exactly resembling hers. There were no angles in her shape or in her face. All was curve and roundness. Neither thought, sentiment, nor passion disturbed by line or flush the equality of her pale, clear skin. Her noble bust heaved with her regular breathing. Her eyes moved a little. By these evidences of life alone could I have distinguished her from some large, handsome figure molded in wax. Hortense was of a middle size and stout. Her form was ungraceful, her face striking, more alive and brilliant than Eulalie's. Her hair was dark brown, her complexion richly colored. There were frolic and mischief in her eye. Consistency and good sense she might possess, but none of her features betokened those qualities. Caroline was little, though evidently full-grown, raven black hair, very dark eyes, absolutely regular features, with a colorless olive complexion, clear as to the face and sallow about the neck, formed in her that assemblage of points whose union may persons regard as the perfection of beauty. How, with the tintless pallor of her skin and the classic straightness of her lineaments, she managed to look sensual, I don't know. I think her lips and eyes contrived the affair between them, and the result left no uncertainty on the beholder's mind. She was sensual now, and in 10 years' time she would be coarse. Promise plain was written in her face of much future folly. If I looked at these girls with little scruple, they looked at me with still less. Eulalie raised her unmoved eye to mine, and seemed to expect passively, but securely, an impromptu tribute to her majestic charms. Hortense regarded me boldly, and giggled at the same time, while she said with an air of impudent freedom, "Dictez-nous quelque chose de facile pour commencer, monsieur." Caroline shook her loose ringlets of abundant but somewhat coarse hair over her rolling black eyes, parting her lips as full as those of a hot-blooded maroon. She showed her well-set teeth sparkling between them, and treated me to the same time to a smile de sa façon. Beautiful as Pauline Borghese, she looked at the moment scarcely purer than Lucrece de Borgia. Caroline was of a noble family. I heard her lady mother's character afterwards, and then I ceased to wonder at the precocious accomplishments of the daughter. These three I at once saw deemed themselves the queens of the school, and conceived that by their splendor they threw all the rest into the shade. In less than 5 minutes they had thus revealed to me their characters, and in less than 5 minutes I had buckled on a breastplate of steely indifference, and let down a visor of impassible austerity. "Take your pens and commence writing," said I, in as dry and trite a voice as if I had been addressing only Jules Vanderkelkov and company. The dictee now commenced. My 3 belles interrupted me perpetually with little silly questions and uncalled-for remarks, to some of which I made no answer, and to others replied very quietly and briefly. "Comment dit-on point et virgule en anglais, monsieur?" "Semicolon, mademoiselle." "Semicolon? Ah, comme c'est drôle!" Giggle. "J'ai une si mauvaise plume, impossible d'écrire. Mais monsieur, je ne sais pas suivre. Vous allez si vite. Je n'ai rien compris, moi." Here a general murmur arose, and the teacher, opening her lips for the first time, ejaculated, "Silence, mademoiselles!" No silence followed. On the contrary, the 3 ladies in front began to talk even more loudly. "C'est si difficile l'anglaise. Je déteste la dictée. Quelle envie d'écrire quelque chose que l'on ne comprend pas." Some of those behind laughed. A degree of confusion began to pervade the class. It was necessary to take prompt measures. "Donnez-moi votre cahier," said I to Eulalie in an abrupt tone, and bending over, I took it before she had time to give it. "Et vous, mademoiselle, donnez-moi le vôtre," continued I, more mildly, addressing a little pale, plain-looking girl who sat in the front row of the other division, and whom I had remarked as being at once the ugliest and most attentive in the room. She rose up, walked over to me, and delivered her book with a grave, modest curtsy. I glanced over the 2 dictations. Eulalie's was slurred, blotted, and full of silly mistakes. Sylvie's, such was the name of the ugly little girl, was clearly written. It contained no error against sense, and but few faults of orthography. I coolly read aloud both exercises, marking the faults. Then I looked at Eulalie. "C'est honteux," said I, and deliberately tore her dictation in 4 parts, and presented her with the fragments. I returned Sylvie her book with a smile, saying, "C'est bien, je suis contente de vous." Sylvie looked calmly pleased. Eulalie swelled like an incensed turkey, but the mutiny was quelled. The conceited coquetry and futile flirtation of the first bench were exchanged for a taciturn sullenness, much more convenient to me, and the rest of my lesson passed without interruption. A bell clanging out in the yard announced the moment for the cessation of school labors. I heard our own bell at the same time, and that of a certain public college immediately after. Order dissolved instantly. Up started every pupil. I hastened to seize my hat, bow to the maîtresse, and quit the room before the tide of externats should pour from the inner class, where I knew near 100 were prisoned, and whose rising tumult I already heard. I had scarcely crossed the hall and gained the corridor when Mademoiselle Reuter came again upon me. "Step in here a moment," said she, and she held open the door of a side room from whence she had issued on my arrival. It was a salle à manger, as appeared from the buffet, and the armoire vitrée, filled with glass and china, which formed part of its furniture. Ere she had closed the door on me and herself, the corridor was already filled with day pupils, tearing down their cloaks, bonnets, and cabas from the wooden pegs on which they were suspended. The shrill voice of a maîtresse was heard at intervals, vainly endeavoring to enforce some sort of order. Vainly, I say. Discipline there was none in these rough ranks, and yet this was considered one of the best conducted schools in Brussels. "Well, you have given your first lesson," began Mademoiselle Reuter in the most calm, equable voice, as though quite unconscious of the chaos from which we were separated only by a single wall. "Were you satisfied with your pupils, or did any circumstance in their conduct give you cause for complaint? Conceal nothing from me, repose in me entire confidence." Happily, I felt in myself complete power to manage my pupils without aid. The enchantment, the golden haze, which had dazzled my perspicuity at first, had been a good deal dissipated. I cannot say I was chagrined or downcast by the contrast which the reality of a pensionnat de demoiselles presented to my vague ideal of the same community. I was only enlightened and amused. Consequently, I felt in no disposition to complain to Mademoiselle Reuter, and I received her considerate invitation to confidence with a smile. "A thousand thanks, mademoiselle, but all has gone very smoothly." She looked more than doubtful. "Et les trois demoiselles de première banque?" said she. "Ah, tout va au mieux," was my answer, and Mademoiselle Reuter ceased to question me. But her eye, not large, not brilliant, not melting or kindling, but astute, penetrating, practical, showed she was even with me. It let out a momentary gleam which said plainly, "Be as close as you like. I am not dependent on your candor. What you would conceal, I already know." By a transition so quiet as to be scarcely perceptible, the directress's manner changed. The anxious business air passed from her face, and she began chatting about the weather and the town, and asking in neighborly wise after Monsieur and Madame Pelet. I answered all her little questions. She prolonged her talk. I went on following its many little windings. She sat so long, said so much, varied so often the topics of discourse, that it was not difficult to perceive she had a particular aim in thus detaining me. Her mere words could have afforded no clue to the aim, but her countenance aided, while her lips uttered only affable commonplaces, her eyes reverted continually to my face. Her glances were not given in full, but out of the corners, so quietly, so stealthily, yet I think I lost not one. I watched her as keenly as she watched me. I perceived soon that she was feeling after my real character. She was searching for salient points and weak points and eccentric points. She was applying now this test, now that, hoping in the end to find some chink, some niche, where she could put in her little firm foot and stand upon my neck, mistress of my nature. Do not mistake me, reader. It was no amorous influence she wished to gain. At that time it was only the power of the politician to which she aspired. I was now installed as a professor in her establishment, and she wanted to know where her mind was superior to mine, by what feeling or opinion she could lead me. I enjoyed the game much, and did not hasten its conclusion. Sometimes I gave her hopes, beginning a sentence rather weakly, when her shrewd eye would light up. She thought she had me. Having led her a little way, I delighted to turn round and finish with sound, hard sense, whereat her countenance would fall. At last a servant entered to announce dinner. The conflict being thus necessarily terminated, we parted without having gained any advantage on either side. Mademoiselle Reuter had not even given me an opportunity of attacking her with feeling, and I had managed to baffle her little schemes of craft. It was a regular drawn battle. I again held out my hand when I left the room. She gave me hers. It was a small and white hand, but how cool! I met her eye, too, in full, obliging her to give me a straightforward look. This last test went against me. It left her as it found her, moderate, temperate, tranquil. Me, it disappointed. I am growing wiser, thought I, as I walked back to Monsieur Pelet's. Look at this little woman. Is she like the women of novelists and romancers? To read a female character as depicted in poetry and fiction, one would think it was made up of sentiment, either for good or bad. Here is a specimen, and a most sensible and respectable specimen, too, whose staple ingredient is abstract reason. No Talleyrand was ever more passionless than Zoraide Reuter. So I thought then. I found afterwards that blunt susceptibilities are very consistent with strong propensities. Chapter 11. I had indeed had a very long talk with the crafty little politician, and on regaining my quarters I found that dinner was half over. To be late at meals was against a standing rule of the establishment, and had it been one of the Flemish ushers who thus entered after the removal of the soup and the commencement of the first course, Monsieur Pelet would probably have greeted him with a public rebuke, and would certainly have mulcted him both of soup and fish. As it was, that polite though partial gentleman only shook his head, and as I took my place, unrolled my napkin, and said my heretical grace to myself, he civilly dispatched a servant to the kitchen to bring me a plate of purée aux carottes. For this was a maigre day, and before sending away the first course, reserved for me a portion of the stock fish of which it consisted. Dinner being over, the boys rushed out for their evening play. Kint and Van Dam, the two ushers, of course, followed them. Poor fellows! If they had not looked so very heavy, so very soulless, so very indifferent to all things in heaven above or in the earth beneath, I could have pitied them greatly for the obligation they were under to trail after those rough lads everywhere and at all times. Even as it was, I felt disposed to scout myself as a privileged prig when I turned to ascend to my chamber, sure to find there, if not enjoyment, at least liberty. But this evening, as had often happened before, I was to be still farther distinguished. Eh bien, mauvais sujet, said the voice of Monsieur Pelet behind me, as I set my foot on the first step of the stair. Où allez-vous? Venez à la salle à manger, que je vous gronde un peu. I beg pardon, monsieur, said I, as I followed him to his private sitting-room, for having returned so late. It was not my fault. That is just what I want to know, rejoined Monsieur Pelet, as he ushered me into the comfortable parlour with a good wood fire, for the stove had now been removed for the season. Having rung the bell, he ordered coffee for two, and presently he and I were seated, almost in English comfort, one on each side of the hearth, a little round table between us, with a coffee-pot, a sugar basin, and two large white china cups. While Monsieur Pelet employed himself in choosing a cigar from a box, my thoughts reverted to the two outcast ushers, whose voices I could hear even now crying hoarsely for order in the playground. C'est une grande responsabilité que la surveillance, observed I. Plaît-il, dit Monsieur Pelet. I remarked that I thought Messieurs Van Dam and Kint must sometimes be a little fatigued with their labours. Des bêtises de somme, murmured scornfully the director. Meantime, I offered him his cup of coffee. Servez-vous, mon garçon, said he blandly, when I had put a couple of huge lumps of continental sugar into his cup. And now, tell me why you stayed so long at Mademoiselle Reuter's. I know that lessons conclude in her establishment as in mine at 4 o'clock, and when you returned it was past 5. Mademoiselle wished to speak with me, monsieur. Indeed? On what subject, if one may ask? Mademoiselle talked about nothing, monsieur. A fertile topic! And did she discourse thereon in the schoolroom before the pupils? No. Like you, monsieur, she asked me to walk into her parlour. And Madame Reuter, the old duenna, my mother's gossip, was there, of course? No, monsieur. I had the honour of being quite alone with mademoiselle. C'est joli, cela, observed Monsieur Pelet, and he smiled and looked into the fire. On y soit qui mal y pense, murmured I significantly. Je connais un peu ma petite voisine, voyez-vous. In that case, Monsieur will be able to aid me in finding out what was Mademoiselle's reason for making me sit before her sofa one mortal hour, listening to the most copious and fluent dissertation on the merest frivolities. She was sounding your character. I thought so, Monsieur. Did she find out your weak point? What is my weak point? Why, the sentimental. Any woman sinking her shaft deep enough will at last reach a fathomless spring of sensibility in thy breast, Crimsworth. I felt the blood stir about my heart and rise warm to my cheek. Some women might, Monsieur. Is Mademoiselle Reuter of the number? Come, speak frankly, mon fils. Elle est encore jeune, plus âgée que toi peut-être, mais juste assez pour unir la tendresse d'une petite maman à l'amour d'une épouse dévouée. N'est pas que cela tire supérieurement? Non, monsieur. I should like my wife to be my wife, and not half my mother. She is then a little too old for you? No, monsieur. Not a day too old if she suited me in other things. In what does she not suit you, William? She is personally agreeable, is she not? Very. Her hair and complexion are just what I admire, and her turn of form, though quite Belgian, is full of grace. Bravo! And her face? Her features? How do you like them? A little harsh, especially her mouth. Ah, yes, her mouth, said Monsieur Pelet, and he chuckled inwardly. There is character about her mouth, firmness, but she has a very pleasant smile, don't you think so? Rather crafty. True, but that expression of craft is owing to her eyebrows. Have you remarked her eyebrows? I answered that I had not. You have not seen her looking down, then, said he. No. It is a treat notwithstanding. Observe her when she has some knitting or some other women's work in hand, and sits the image of peace, calmly intent on her needles and her silk, some discussion meantime going on around her, in the course of which peculiarities of character are being developed, or important interests canvassed. She takes no part in it. Her humble feminine mind is wholly with her knitting. None of her features move. She neither presumes to smile approval, nor frown disapprobation. Her little hands assiduously ply their unpretending task. If she can only get this purse finished or this bonnet grec completed, it is enough for her. If gentlemen approach her chair, a deep quiescence, a meeker modesty settles on her features, and clothes her general mien. Observe then her eyebrows, et dites-moi s'il n'est pas de chat dans l'un et de renard dans l'autre. I will take careful notice the first opportunity, said I. And then, continued Monsieur Pelet, the eyelid will flicker, the light-coloured lashes be lifted a second, and a blue eye, glancing out from under the screen, will take its brief, sly, searching survey, and retreat again. I smiled, and so did Monsieur Pelet, and after a few minutes' silence I asked, Will she ever marry, do you think? Marry? Will birds pair? Of course, it is both her intention and resolution to marry when she finds a suitable match, and no one is better aware than herself of the sort of impression she is capable of producing. No one likes better to captivate in a quiet way. I am mistaken if she will not yet leave the print of her stealing steps on thy heart, Crimsworth. Of her steps? Confound it, no. My heart is not a plank to be walked on. But the soft touch of a patte de velours will do it no harm. She offers me no patte de velours. She is all form and reserve with me. That is to begin with. Let respect be the foundation, affection the first floor, love the superstructure. Mademoiselle Reuter is a skilful architect. And interest, Monsieur Pelet, interest. Will not Mademoiselle consider that point? Yes, yes, no doubt. It will be the cement between every stone. And now we have discussed the directress. What of the pupils? N'y a-t-il pas de belles études parmi ces jeunes têtes? Studies of character? Yes, curious ones at least, I imagine, but one cannot divine much from a first interview. Ah, you affect discretion. But tell me now, were you not a little abashed before those blooming young creatures? At first, yes, but I rallied and got through all with du sang-froid. I don't believe you. It is true, notwithstanding. At first I thought them angels, but they did not leave me long under that delusion. 3 of the eldest and handsomest undertook the task of setting me right, and they managed so cleverly that in 5 minutes I knew them, at least for what they were, 3 errant coquettes. Je les connais, exclaimed Monsieur Pelet. Elles sont toujours au premier rang, à l'église et à la promenade. Un blond superbe, un joli espiègle, une belle brune. Exactly. Lovely creatures, all of them. Heads for artists. What a group they would make taken together. Eulalie, I know their names, with her smooth braided hair and calm ivory brow. Hortense, with her rich chestnut locks so luxuriantly knotted, plaited, twisted, as if she did not know how to dispose of all their abundance, with her vermilion lips, damask cheeks, and roguish laughing eye. And Caroline de Blemont. Ah, there is a beauty, beauty in perfection. What a cloud of sable curls about the face of a houri! What fascinating lips! What glorious black eyes! Your Byron would have worshipped her. And you cold, frigid islander, you played the austere, the insensible in the presence of an Aphrodite so exquisite. I might have laughed at the director's enthusiasm had I believed it real, but there was something in his tone which indicated got-up raptures. I felt he was only affecting fervor in order to put me off my guard, to induce me to come out in return, so I scarcely even smiled. He went on. Confess, William, do not the mere good looks of Zoraide Reuter appear dowdyish and commonplace compared with the splendid charms of some of her pupils? The question discomposed me, but I now felt plainly that my principal was endeavoring, for reasons best known to himself, at that time I could not fathom them, to excite ideas and wishes in my mind alien to what was right and honorable. The iniquity of the instigation proved its antidote, and when he further added, each of those 3 beautiful girls will have a handsome fortune, and with a little address, a gentleman-like, intelligent young fellow like you might make himself master of the hand, heart, and purse of any one of the trio. I replied by a look and an interrogative, Monsieur, which startled him. He laughed a forced laugh, affirmed that he had only been joking, and demanded whether I could possibly have thought him in earnest. Just then the bell rang, the play hour was over. It was an evening on which Monsieur Pelet was accustomed to read passages from the drama and the belles lettres to his pupils. He did not wait for my answer, but rising, left the room, humming as he went some gay strain of Berenger's. And that is where we will leave off for today, reading The Professor. Again, a lot of French. I'm absolutely positive I've butchered some of it. I apologize to, again, anyone who speaks French. I did my best. And there's going to be more, so we're going to have to struggle bug through it together. But that is it for today. If you liked this video, if you liked this channel, please like, subscribe, follow, share me with all your friends. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye!